Many people will say to you, sure, you can lower your blood sugar by eating low-carb, high-fat, but all that fat is going to accumulate in your arteries and soon you'll have a heart attack. But is that really true? What's the evidence for that statement? Coming up. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description. Today we're going to look at the idea that has been drummed into the heads of Americans and people actually all over the world for the last 50 years. The idea that fat will make you fat, and not only will it make you fat, but it will quickly clog up your arteries and give you a heart attack. And of course, if that really is true, the last thing anybody ought to do would be to go on a low-carb, high-fat diet. But there's a serious flaw inherent in this concept. The studies and the research that have been done with high-fat, low-carb diets simply do not agree. In fact, people are now beginning to realize that the incredible pressure that has been put on Americans and people all over the world to eat less and less and less fat, to eat low-fat yogurt and low-fat salad dressing and low-fat meals and low-fat snacks and low-fat milk and to shave your fat intake down to almost nothing. Well, this advice and dogma, as well-meaning as its proponents are, is in truth dead wrong. On today's video, I'll be sharing some quotes from a book by Dr. Mark Hyman, which is titled, Eat Fat, Get Thin. The book does not address diabetes as its major emphasis, but this subject is terribly relevant to diabetics. Because if the old school thought is right, the idea that fat is directly and primarily responsible for heart disease, then any low-carb approach to beating diabetes is just trading one misery for another, bigger misery. Dr. Mark Hyman is an interesting guy. He is in some sense a celebrity doctor. He's often on television. He served as medical advisor for former President Bill Clinton, and you can find him all over YouTube. And he seems to be a favorite with Dr. Oz, and he's been on his show several times, I believe. For my regular followers, I'll have to say up front that Dr. Hyman is not exactly one of us. I found that out when I was watching him being interviewed, and after condemning a lot of popular high-sugar breakfast foods, he was asked, well, what should I eat? And to my dismay, he listed oatmeal as one choice, which is something most diabetics probably would want to avoid. And if you don't believe that, well, you just go ask Mike, my associate, and my good friend, the blood sugar meter. Nevertheless, Dr. Hyman has come a long way, especially in terms of his view of fat. I would say that he's sort of a hybrid between Dr. Joel Fuhrman and Dr. Jason Fung, with a little bit of Ivor Cummins thrown in for good measure. At the very beginning of his introduction to the book, he asks, what is the single best thing you can do for your health, your weight, and longevity? And then he answers his question by declaring, eat more fat. Eat more fat to lose weight, feel good, prevent heart disease, diabetes, dementia, and cancer, and live longer. Wow! If a doctor had written a book beginning with those words back in 1985, he would have been persecuted, criticized, condemned, and drummed out of the medical industry. But today, this idea is not all that much of a shock to people who've kept up with the research, the literature, and the ever-increasing groundswell of support for a low-carb, high-fat diet, a support that's coming from voices all over the world. Now, Dr. Hyman has not always thought this way, as he makes it clear in his book. In his earlier years, he pushed the high-carb, low-fat mantra just as religiously as every other doctor and probably more than most. He writes this, "If you're confused, it's not hard to understand why. I was confused myself, and I recommended low-fat diets to my patients for years. For decades, the advice from pretty much every doctor, nutritionist, professional society, and government agency had been to eat less fat to lose weight and prevent disease. Not only is this advice not working, it's actually doing us harm. It turns out that eating less fat results in more obesity and disease. Dr. Hyman acknowledges that we've all grown up in a society which preaches to us that fat makes us fat and clogs our arteries. This propaganda has been pushed at us from nearly every medical professional, and even the United States government has gotten into the act. But Mark writes this, "None of this is scientifically true. It's based on flawed science and ignores compelling evidence to the contrary. Our fear of fat has created a big fat health mess." Mark Hyman's evolution from fat fearer to fat promoter came as a result of two things. First, he's a reader. He likes to read the studies, and he's read multitudes of studies and research trials which contradict the low-fat dogma. And second, as he began to change his recommendations to his patients, he monitored them closely to see what effect a high-fat diet was having, and he discovered they were not only losing weight, but their blood lipids were improving, and not just by a little, but by a lot. They were improving dramatically, almost miraculously. Mark writes, "I changed how I practiced medicine and saw with my own eyes the dramatic results in my patients' lab tests, bodies, and health. One patient, for example, increased the fat in his diet to about 50% of his overall food intake, and his cholesterol dropped 100 points. His triglycerides dropped 300 points in just 10 days, and his chronic asthma and reflux went away while his energy soared." Well, it's kind of funny. By reading a little bit between the lines, it seems like Dr. Hyman began recommending that his patients eat more fat even before he himself was 100% convinced. But as they followed his suggestion and then came back for blood tests, he was amazed and excited to see that their markers of health were improving all across the board. And the more patients he observed, the more convinced he became that low-carb, high-fat was the way to go. Now, to add a personal note, I hear this kind of thing all the time from viewers of this YouTube channel. Once they switch to a low-carb, high-fat diet, not only does their blood sugar drop like a stone, not only do they lose weight, the cholesterol ratios improve, their triglycerides drop dramatically, and often it doesn't take much time for all of this. I hear this so often, I would be astonished to hear from someone who went from a standard American diet to a low-carb, high-fat diet, and this did not happen. Dr. Hyman lists a number of conclusions he's come to after his research and the testimonies of thousands of his patients. Those conclusions include these. Dietary fat, and saturated fat specifically, does not cause heart disease. Dietary saturated fat raises the good kind of LDL, the light fluffy LDL, and releases HDL, the good cholesterol. Dietary fat reduces inflammation, risk for clotting, and all heart disease risk factors. Dietary fat improves blood vessel health. Diets very high in fat and low in carbs can reverse type 2 diabetes. Carbohydrates, not dietary fats, turn into saturated fats in your blood, the fats that cause heart disease. Sugar and refined carbs, not fat, are responsible for the epidemic of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease, and the increased risk of dementia and premature deaths. Dr. Hyman goes into some detail about his own personal transformation. He tells how that in his younger years he was a vegetarian, eating very low fat and very high carb. He assumed this was the healthiest way to live and eat, and that by eating this way he'd stay slim all of his life. But it did not happen. And by the way, he was also a runner and a jogger, so for a while he was able to stave off weight gain. But eventually his age began to catch up with him. By his mid-30s, he was getting pudgy and his waist was swelling, while still on his extremely low-fat vegetarian diet. Now, this was not because he was eating junk food. Still, the pounds were coming on, and even spending hours and hours huffing and puffing on his exercise bike did not help. In his frustration, he began to read about studies that demonstrated that eating fat does not make you fat. In fact, it does the reverse. You tend to lose weight on a low-carb, high-fat diet. And finally, Mark Hyman could not resist any longer, and he began to move in that direction. He writes, "I began to change my own eating habits and my recommendations to my patients. I saw people lose 100 or more pounds and reverse type 2 diabetes. I saw my patients get off insulin and optimize all their cholesterol levels, not by eating less fat, but by eating more fat." And Dr. Hyman not only saw this in his patients, he saw positive results in his own health. As he forced himself to overcome his fear of fat, he lost 15 pounds and reduced his waist by 2 inches. Now, 20 years later, he writes, "At 55 years old, I am more muscular and fit than I've ever been, while working out less. I feel younger and more energetic than ever. Now I eat fat for breakfast without fear and guilt, with a big smile on my face and a deeply satisfied tummy." Dr. Hyman shares a small little study that dealt with 10 men. Now, I'll grant it that a study of 10 cannot be a definitive answer about anything, but still it was telling. 10 obese men were in a metabolic ward in a hospital and agreed to eat only what was given them for 2 two-week periods. Since they were in a hospital, cheating was next to impossible. So, for 2 weeks, they were fed a high-carb diet that was 70% carbs and 10% fat. Then they took a 7-day break. And then they were put on a diet that was the exact opposite, 70% fat and 10% carbs. The calories for both diets were exactly the same. But for the 2 weeks of high-fat, low-carb eating, these obese men's improvement was superior in every way to their 2 weeks of high-carb, low-fat eating. Their glucose levels went down, their insulin levels, triglycerides, and cholesterol were all vastly superior eating the high-fat than when eating the high-carb diet. In a vastly larger study, eating meat and increasing fat intake proved to be not only not harmful, but in fact beneficial. Dr. Hyman writes this, "When the effects of increasing meat intake was studied in Asian countries using a sample of almost 300,000 people, they found red meat was actually associated with a lower risk of heart disease in men and a lower risk of cancer in women. In one important caveat, however, Mark, after mentioning a study which demonstrated that a diet of high fat and high saturated fat produces no impact on inflammatory markers or oxidative stress, 2 things that unquestionably lead to heart disease, he writes this, "In other studies, saturated fat seems to promote inflammation only in the presence of too many carbs or too little fiber, or there's no connection at all." Now, from my limited knowledge, almost every keto expert and researcher seems to agree that the one case where fat and saturated fat can be a problem is when you consume them in the context of a high-carb diet. So you eat lots of fat and few carbs, no problem. But eat lots of fat and lots of carbs, big problem. If you're going to move toward a high-fat diet, you simply are going to have to simultaneously cut those carbs significantly if you want optimum health. The book we've been looking at is titled Eat Fat, Grow Thin by Dr. Mark Hyman. On the cover of the book, it says it is or was on the New York Times bestseller list, which is no small feat. As I mentioned earlier, he's probably not as strict as I am about some foods in connection with diabetes. He seems to have little problem with fruit, for example. But all in all, he's right about a lot of things. And if anybody switched from a standard American diet to his dietary plan, they would do themselves a world of good. Now, Mark is a convert. He didn't start out in the low-carb, high-fat camp. In fact, just the opposite. But he's smart enough to recognize that when something just flat does not work, it's time to drop it. And if you find something else that does work far better, it's time to embrace it. Today, Mark Hyman is an evangelist for the high-fat diet, one of many thousands of voices rising up, even from the ranks of medical professionals, and declaring that the high-fat, low-carb diet is here to stay, and that for diabetics there's simply no other diet that can touch it. Okay, that'll do it for now. As always, if you found this helpful, give it a thumbs up, not to make me feel better, but to make YouTube notice it and promote it to other diabetics who go to their search engine and type in things like how to beat diabetes. And if you haven't yet subscribed, consider doing that so you'll be notified every time we post a new video. God bless, and see you again soon.